I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam Nations. And on behalf of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, CRRF, the sponsor for today's events, and the Center for Civic Religious Literacy, CCRL, the organizer of today's roundtable, I would like to extend a warm welcome to all of you for attending our panel discussion, Racism in Civil Society, Seeking Room for Dialogue. My name is Alan Fakirani, and I am the Regional Director for British Columbia for CCRL, and I will be moderating, I have the great pleasure actually to be moderating today's discussion amongst our very distinguished panelists. I would be remiss if I didn't also thank these 5 wonderful individuals for joining us in an open, honest, and importantly, solution-oriented discussion on issues of race and racism in British Columbia and the Lower Mainland. So we have with us today Kasari Govinder, BC Human Rights Commissioner, Alison Dudley, Executive Director of Multiculturalism Branch of the BC's Ministry of Tourism, Arts and Culture. We also have with us Laura Mannix, the Director of Community Development for Diversity, Jennifer Reddy, School Board Trustee for Vancouver Public Schools, and Dr. Musa Magasa, who's a Human Rights Education Advisor for the University of Victoria. So I could go into much detail about each of our panelists, long-standing work in ameliorating race relations in BC, but of course to do so would eat up valuable time that we'd like to reserve for our panel discussion and our ensuing roundtable. Suffice it to say that our panelists represent a broad cross-section of individuals and organizations that represent government, NGO, academia, and you can find more details of their profile in the brochures that are available to you, and as well on our website, www.ccrl/CLRC.ca. The website is also on your brochure. So we know that there's been a rise and escalation of racial tensions in Canada and BC. Statistics Canada has released findings on the increase of reported hate crimes in Canada, and we have seen an alarming 47% increase in police-reported hate crimes between 2016 and 2017. And of course here I emphasize the word reported because we very well know that there's usually a gap between incidents of crime and their reporting. So closer to home, the media has reported on multiple incidents of racism in the Lower Mainland, from parking lot confrontations to desecration of spaces with racist graffiti, to the recent racially motivated detainment of an Indigenous grandfather and his granddaughter at one of Canada's top 3 banks. We acknowledge that there is a problem and that these issues exist. To deny that these incidents are problematic would be extremely disingenuous. With that said, while we know that racism has not gone away, it is important for us to move the discussion forward. In the 2019 survey on the state of race relations in Canada, conducted by the Canadian Race Relations Foundation and Environics, while racialized respondents feel that racism is still an issue for them living in Canada, they also have a general sense of optimism that while things aren't perfect, there is room for growth and for moving towards a more inclusive and less racist society. As the report states, quote, "Looking to the future, Canadians as a whole are generally optimistic that progress toward racial equality will happen in their lifetime. More notably, strong optimism about future progress towards racial equality is most evident among Canadians 18 to 29 years of age. Indigenous people and those born in another country, racialized Canadians expect the future will mean less rather than more racism for the next generation of people with their own background," end quote. The report can also be accessed for free on the Canadian Race Relations Foundation website. Again, the details are on your brochure. So it is in that spirit of optimism that we welcome all of you today to our discussion. Our big questions and general theme for today is how can civil society organizations like those represented in our panel today foster this sense of optimism and create actual discernible steps for the improvement of race relations in this country? What are the practical steps that these individuals and their organizations have undertaken to foster the improvement of race relations in Canada? And likewise, we want to have your voice and your input into this conversation as well. So while we acknowledge that those in attendance may have experienced racial discrimination and incidents of racism in their lives, sticky pages. Today we are seeking your thoughts on how we can improve things for our communities here in BC and across the country. We hope that this panel discussion will engage your hearts, minds, and spirits to think of the solutions we need to make Canada a more prosperous, equal, and just society. And on that note, I'd like to once again thank you for joining us today. Let's begin our dialogue. So the questions, the way that we've sort of done it is they're broad questions that we're going to throw out to our panelists. And any panelist is welcome to step in at any time to sort of share their thoughts on it. And what we're hoping for is truly that. It's a dialogue, it's a conversation. So I'm not going to just pick on one person. Ideally, what I'd like to see happen is for me to throw a question at somebody responds to it, and then somebody else jumps in with their own thoughts, their own opinions on it, and then we actually have a conversation. What I've also noticed is that the panelists actually have a great sense of familiarity with one another and their work, so I'm hoping that that will also provide us with a more organic discussion. So let's begin with our first question, which is, I think, a good place to start because we talk about this word racism quite a bit, and perhaps it's a good place for us to really think about, well, what does racism actually mean? What are the outcomes of what we would call racism? So let me throw that question to our panelists. I know it's a very sort of intro question, but I think it might get us to begin our conversation. So let's start with that. What does racism mean? And what does it explicitly and implicitly include when we discuss it in society today?
Hi everyone, thank you for being here. It's on. Thank you. So I'm gonna, at the risk of stating the obvious here, I'm gonna jump in. I think I've been really thinking about the context of racism from a quote from Robin DiAngelo, who's the author excuse me, of White Fragility. And she talks about how racism is a structure, not an event. And so I think those two aspects of racism are so important to name. One are the events of racism, and another way to think of that, I think, is the interpersonal aspects of racism, the manifestations, some of which we've just heard about, the BMO incident, the you dropped your coronavirus kind of incidents that go back to where you came from, the hurtful and disturbing individual manifestations of racism that are so important for us to combat. And from my perspective, part of why I've been kind of working on, I'm thinking about these aspects and naming them is because as the new Human Rights Commissioner, I'm entering a human rights system in which there's already a human rights body that's been dealing with these individual manifestations and interpersonal conflicts. That's Human Rights Tribunal. And the other piece of kind of the racist, one of the other big pieces of the racist picture are the systemic manifestations of racism. And that's what the Office of the Human Rights Commission is being set up to kind of look at and engage with, are systemic manifestations of inequality and injustice, of course, one of which is racism. And I think it's also important to name that kind of racism. So in addition to the individual manifestations, the interpersonal aspects are the pieces of how our society itself is set up to entrench racial hierarchy. So the fact that Indigenous people are way overrepresented in prisons, for example, that is systemic racism at play. The fact that far too many Indigenous families are caught up in the child protection system. More than 60% of children in care are Indigenous, and yet the population in BC is somewhere less than 5%. So these kinds of deeply entrenched inequalities are the other aspect and the manifestations of racism that I think it's important to name.
Great. Thank you for getting us going. And anybody, Dr. Magasa, please.
I think, thank you so much, Cecil. I think you just set the table for us to talk about racism. Let me maybe add a bit to that, and I'm going to talk a bit about the personal. and also then connect it back to the system. For me, racism is everyday prejudice, indignities, discrimination, harassment, exclusion, psychological, cultural, and social violence that is directed to people like me and other white people. That, for me, when I think about racism, that's what I know it is. Racism, it is people who stand by and not do anything. I'm sure some of you have heard me. When I was 17 in a coffee shop in Paris, I was beaten until I was flat in front of 29 adults by a white boy who called me nigger. And I replied to him and said, there is no country in Africa called a nigger. That was the only thing I did, and I got a beating. But what shocked me is, as we say, the systemic and the social, that police couldn't lay charges because that boy walked away alone. And no one in this coffee shop did anything. What they did, they pretended they didn't see anything. They didn't hear anything. That's why they couldn't do anything. For me, that's racism. Racism is personal. We experience it personal. And the system, as we say, support it, embed it through the culture, the policies, the practices, the institutions. Let me just give you a couple of examples. I think I wrote it just to be very clear. When we talk about racism or racism in a context of a white supremacy culture, one of the things is, for example, for people working in an institution, it is what we call the deficit model of assessment of their contribution and their talent. Oftentimes, newcomers, we know that. And the best way they do it is you are overqualified for not giving you the job. Even you do a good job, you are always underrated. Another thing is that the little appreciation that people get for their job, for the job well done, the more common is to talk about their inadequacies, not about their good side. So I want you to personalize what is racism for the individuals and the groups, and then think about maybe why the system is what it is, and how the system embeds those practices, policies, and behaviors.
Thank you. I don't know if there's anybody else who wants to add to that. Thank you again for the personal, adding that personal dimension to it. I have a question, and maybe I said I wasn't going to call on anybody, but I'm going to take my word back. But we were talking about systemic racism, and we can even talk about systemic violence as well. One philosopher who spoke about this idea of systemic violence is Galton, who talks about how society sort of hegemonize these systems. I'm an educator. My passion is that. My passion is education, and we have somebody here with us who's on the school board. I was just wondering, Jennifer, perhaps maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how schools have a role to play in. Let's forget talking about how they play a role in creating systems or in continuing systems. Let's talk about how they can potentially break those systems of violence, of structural racism. What can our education systems today do to build, let's go back to that sense of optimism, to create that sense of optimism for our children?
Yeah, I really like your question, Alim, and thank you so much for Kasari and Dr. Musa for sharing that framework. It really fires me up because I see a couple of things at play. So I'm in an elected role in an educational institution, and that's a governance and leadership role. And I think what I'm learning about that, that's really grounds my work, is that one of the main calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is to use the Indigenous rights, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, as a framework for reconciliation. And so often we go straight to just trying to do something without looking at how many voices have already been framed around what that solution should look like. So I think just starting with a basic declaration that we stand with that can help us a lot in terms of linking our actions to something meaningful and tangible. Having said that, though, I think it's a lot of political will as well in terms of taking care of the structural deficits. So without kind of going too deep into like the origins of education and schooling, one of the things that I think about is that it took political will to remove an anti-racism policy in our district, and it will take political will to bring it back. And so it's just that choice, it's just that powerful. And so for me, it's kind of an obvious opportunity to think about the structural barriers. Maybe I can share one more example.
Please.
Maybe some of you heard of like the Cecil Rhodes monument. Is that like a, yeah? So Cecil Rhodes is like the father of apartheid. He has nothing to do with Canada, but a lot to do with our structural genocidal history, and internationally as well. So in 2017, there's this monument with his name on it in an elementary school playground in Vancouver. And it came to my attention, why should that come to a trustee? It doesn't make sense to me. But the fact that it came to me gave me pause to realize, wow, our systemic structure didn't have a check in place to see why would we uphold a monument of Cecil Rhodes. This was 2019. I found out later the monument was actually put up in 2017, 2 years after the international outcry for Rhodes must fall. So I'm thinking, was there no stipulation to do a Google search just on who this guy was? Like, basics, right? But it's not a particular individual's fault, it's a structural fault. So I think that that's where I'm like, wow, that's how easy it is to actually see it, name it, and solve it, and to believe people when they share experiences, especially children and youth. So that's
Thank you.
so I took my jacket off.
Solve it, I like that. See it, name it, solve it. And again, I think that solve it part is exactly what I'm really hopeful we can discuss today. I don't know if Allison or if Laura, you want to add anything. I know, Laura, you're really much on the field. You're working with individuals coming from racial minority backgrounds. I don't know if you want to speak to what you're actually seeing, what people are telling you, what their lives might look like as racialized individuals. To give a little bit of context, you're working also out in Surrey, and we know that there is a large visible minority population